June 27th, 1994, Tacoma, Washington. 25-year-old Michael Johnston and 19-year-old Rochelle Robinson leave a get-together at a friend's house. Later that morning, Michael is found shot to death outside Rochelle's vehicle with his throat slashed. Rochelle is soon found stabbed to death on a remote road with her own throat slashed, and even though Michael was married, it turned out the two victims had been carrying on a secret affair. Investigators would explore numerous leads, including an unidentified stalker who allegedly targeted Rochelle, and the possibility that the murders were linked to the occult. But the crime continues to remain unsolved. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we'll be presenting one of our 2-for-1 episodes in covering two different cases which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries: the 1994 murders of Michael Johnston and Rochelle Robinson, and the unexplained 1984 death of Kurt McFall. That voice you just heard narrating our opening was the winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, Austina Kronk, who did a tremendous job, so thank you very much, Austina. As you probably know, I have made it a recurring monthly contest to hold a random draw in which I pick the name of a winner who has earned the opportunity to record themselves reciting the opening narration of a Trail Went Cold episode. If you would like to learn how to enter this contest, I will be providing instructions about how to do so near the end of this episode. Anyway, there are two particular reasons I have decided to cover the murders of Michael Johnston and Rochelle Robinson today. Number one, that was the case Austina requested when she originally entered our contest. And number two, it takes place in Washington State. You may have heard that a lot of cold cases have been getting solved lately, and one of them was another double murder from Washington which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. It involved a young British Columbia couple named Jay Cook and Tanya von Kylenburg, who were both murdered after traveling to Seattle in 1987. But DNA evidence has recently led to the arrest of a suspect. Since the murders of Michael Johnston and Rochelle Robinson happened to take place near Tacoma, perhaps lightning will strike twice. There isn't a ton of information available about this particular case, so I thought it would be a good idea to cover it alongside another classic Unsolved Mysteries case, the death of Kurt McFall. The biggest similarity between these two cases is that the victims were into fantasy games, and, well, this led to speculation that their deaths were connected to Satanism and the occult. Well, you're certainly going to hear my thoughts about that in a little while. I'll begin by analyzing Michael and Rochelle's murders before I move on to Kurt's case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is finally on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards from yours truly, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the murders of Michael Johnston and Rochelle Robinson. Our story begins in Washington State in 1994. Our central figures are 25-year-old Michael Johnston, who lives in Tacoma, and 19-year-old Rochelle Robinson, who lives in the nearby town of Spanaway. Interestingly enough, Rochelle was originally born in Yuba County, California, the same location where our episode about the Yuba County 5 took place, but she has since moved away from there and is studying to become a teacher. In spite of the fact that Michael is married and has 2 children, he and Rochelle are currently engaged in a secret affair. On the evening of June 26th, they both went to a get-together at a friend's house in order to play the fantasy card game Magic the Gathering. Afterward, Michael and Rochelle both left in their separate cars, but this would turn out to be the last time they were seen alive. During the early morning hours of June 27th, Rochelle's vehicle was found abandoned on a wooded road located near a shooting range called the Tacoma Sportsman Club, and Michael's body was lying on the ground outside. His throat had been slashed before he was shot in the back of the head. Forensic evidence suggested that Michael was handcuffed at one point and forced to kneel down before he was murdered. There was no sign of Rochelle, but later that day, her body was discovered on a private remote road 5 miles away. She had been stabbed several times, and her throat slashed all the way to the bone before her body was covered by a large cardboard box. Interestingly enough, Rochelle also happened to be wearing Michael's t-shirt inside out. Michael's car was found in Spanaway, about a mile from where Rochelle lived. It was theorized that after leaving their friend's house, Rochelle and Michael met at this location and left together in Rochelle's car. They drove to the secluded road near the Sportsman Club and pulled over to have sex before they were interrupted by their killer. The perpetrator likely ordered the couple to get dressed, which prompted Rochelle to hastily put on Michael's t-shirt inside out. At some point, Michael was handcuffed, and after the couple was forced outside the vehicle at gunpoint, Michael was forced to kneel down before his throat was slashed and he was shot to death. Since there were knife pricks on Rochelle's throat, this seemed to indicate that the killer had held a knife there in order to force her to do what they wanted. Rochelle was subsequently abducted and driven to a remote spot miles away before she herself was murdered. Well, given the fact that Michael had been conducting an extramarital affair, the first potential suspect on the radar was his wife, Janet Johnston. Some red flags were raised once it was discovered that the couple had each taken out large life insurance policies on each other. However, Janet denied any involvement in the murders and claimed that they had mutually decided to take out the policies for the purpose of providing for their 2 children in the event that something happened to either of them. Janet was cooperative with the police and passed a polygraph, so they became satisfied that she wasn't involved in the murder. However, a friend of Rochelle's provided a potentially interesting lead when he told police that in the months leading up to her death, Rochelle had become fearful that she was being stalked by a man. Apparently, Rochelle had lunch with this man on one occasion, but after that, he refused to leave her alone. He would frequently come into the Taco Bell restaurant where Rochelle worked and just stare at her, and he also followed her home multiple times. Unfortunately, none of Rochelle's friends or co-workers actually knew the identity of this alleged stalker, but described him as being a white male who was approximately 25 to 30 years old and had brownish blonde hair and acne. A composite sketch was created for this unidentified man, and police considered him to be the most promising suspect. But the case became more complicated when Janet Johnston hired a private investigator named Jim Wright, who subsequently decided to seek the assistance of psychic Nancy Meyer. Now, Nancy Meyer is one of the more prominent police psychics out there and has worked with law enforcement on hundreds of criminal cases since the 1970s. In fact, Unsolved Mysteries once produced an entire segment about Meyer and her investigation into the 1993 murder of a 12-year-old girl named Jennifer Odom. In this particular case, Meyer seemed to believe that because of his devout interest in fantasy card games like Magic the Gathering, Michael was also involved with the world of black magic and the occult, and that this paved the way to his death. Jim Wright brought Meyer to the road where Michael was murdered, and she apparently started having visions of the crime. According to Meyer, there were 3 people involved, and the mastermind was a man in his early 30s who taught at a local college or university and may have killed before. This man and Michael had supposedly been involved in black magic together and decided to kill him over, quote, violating some kind of regulations. Contrary to the police's theory, Meyer believed that Rochelle was killed first after the couple drove to the remote road where her body was found. The 3 perpetrators then abducted Michael and drove Rochelle's car to the spot near the Sportsman Club before they proceeded to kill him too. Meyer described the 2 accomplices as being in their 20s and was not sure if they actively participated in the murders, but they were both controlled by the leader and were possibly in danger of being murdered themselves in the future. Composite sketches were made of the 3 suspects Meyer supposedly saw in her vision, and she also claimed to have seen a dragon wing medallion and felt it might be connected to the case somehow. In spite of this, The police were very skeptical about Meyer's claims and felt the murders were not connected in any way to black magic or the occult. Even though Meyer maintained that Michael was the primary target, investigators continued to believe the killer was someone who had an obsession with Rochelle. The key piece of evidence was the large cardboard box which covered Rochelle's body, as forensic tests seemed to indicate that the killer brought it with them. The box was originally used to hold large sheets of high-grade paper used by professional printers, and the killer may have had the box in their possession for years before they left it behind at the murder scene. However, even though a $16,000 reward was offered for information, it has failed to uncover any solid suspects, and the murders of Michael Johnston and Rochelle Robinson remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Okay, I'll just start my analysis off by sharing this quote by Robert Stack from the beginning of the Unsolved Mystery segment, which describes the fantasy card game which Michael and Rochelle played on the night they were killed. The game involves mystical creatures, magic and fantasy, elements that some say push participants dangerously close to ritual violence and the occult. Well, the game was not specifically named during the segment, but it's since been confirmed that it was Magic the Gathering. Yeah, I'm the first person to admit that I know virtually nothing about fantasy role-playing games or fantasy card games or fantasy stuff in general, but I've known my fair share of people who have played Magic the Gathering, and none of them are involved in black magic. I know that the game had only been around for about a year at the time this crime took place, and the Unsolved Mystery segment came out in 1996, but given the amount of popularity and mainstream acceptability that Magic the Gathering has today, the idea that it could drive people to commit murder is pretty laughable. I also want to address the psychic from this segment, Nancy Meyer. The show referred to Meyer as a quote-unquote respected psychic, and claimed she had turned up critical clues in about 80% of the investigations she worked on. And to be fair, when it comes to police psychics, she does appear to be more credible than most, and you don't hear stories of her constantly being exposed as a fraud like, say, Sylvia Browne. All that being said, I believe that Meyer completely missed the boat on this particular case, and that her claims about Michael and Rochelle being murdered over black magic and the occult have muddied up the investigation. I mean, according to Meyer's so-called visions, the mastermind behind this crime was a local college or university teacher in his 30s, and she even provided a detailed description of him. You'd think that would make it a lot easier to narrow down the list of potential perpetrators, but it doesn't sound like police ever found any promising suspects. The man also supposedly had 2 accomplices who were in danger of being murdered themselves, but it doesn't sound like this ever happened either. And hey, since I just mentioned Sylvia Browne, I should also mention that Michael's wife, Janet Johnston, once appeared on a Seattle talk show with her, and Browne said she believed the murders were a crime of passion committed by someone who wrongly believed that Michael and Rochelle were romantically linked, and that the killings were connected to a man named Paul L.P. Well, Browne was incorrect about the wrongly believed part, since Michael and Rochelle were clearly having an affair, but otherwise, that scenario sounds far more plausible than what Nancy Meyer proposed. And when Sylvia Browne is presenting a much more believable theory about an unsolved crime than you are, that's a major credibility issue. I am totally on the police's side on this one, and agree with their theory that this was a crime of passion, and that the perpetrator was specifically targeting Rochelle. Even if you take out all the black magic nonsense, I have no idea how Meyer could look at the evidence and believe that the killer or killers came across the couple parked on that remote isolated road, murdered Rochelle, and then transported both Michael and Rochelle's car to the spot outside the Tacoma Sportsman Club before they killed him. What would be the point of moving Rochelle's car, and why not kill Michael at the same location? It's just so much more plausible that the perpetrator killed Michael first, and then took Rochelle to another location in his own vehicle because he wanted to have her alone when he killed her. While Michael was shot, Rochelle died a much more protracted death by being stabbed repeatedly and having her throat slashed all the way to the bone, so I think that's a pretty strong indication that the killer's issue was with her. It's a shame Unsolved Mysteries had to shoehorn all the occult stuff into its segment, because this is a pretty harrowing crime on its own without it. On the surface, it seems the most likely suspect is the unidentified stalker Rochelle supposedly had. However, before I go into that, I want to address Michael's wife Janet. You can see why she would have a motive to commit this crime, as her husband was cheating on her and she had a life insurance policy on him. It's not entirely clear if Janet knew about Michael and Rochelle's affair beforehand, as during her Unsolved Mysteries interview, she kind of gives this vague statement about how she didn't know how long the affair was going on, or if they were going to stop soon, or if he was going to leave her. I guess the implication is that Janet did know about the affair, but had not yet decided how she was going to handle it. The segment states that the police cleared Janet as the suspect because she passed a polygraph, though given how unreliable they are, I hope they did a lot more than that to establish she wasn't involved. But overall, I am inclined to think Janet had nothing to do with the crime, as I think the perpetrator being someone who had an obsession with Rochelle just fits the facts so much better. It's interesting how Michael and Rochelle did not leave their friend's house together that night, but instead left in their own separate cars, met up at a location near Rochelle's house, and then drove to the spot near the sportsman club. Given how secluded that spot was, I don't think the killer would have just come across them by chance, so they were probably followed. And this fits the criteria of the killer being Rochelle's stalker, since he apparently had a habit of following her. If he was shadowing Rochelle that night, and saw another man climb into her car so they could drive to a remote spot to have sex, then this might have been what set him off into a murderous rage. For all we know, this might have been the first time he discovered that Michael and Rochelle were having an affair, and he may not have even known Michael was already married. So he follows the couple, interrupts them after they park their car, kills Michael, abducts Rochelle, and then drives her to a more isolated location to murder her. As far as I know, Rochelle was not sexually assaulted, but she was murdered in a much more brutal fashion than Michael, so it definitely sounds like there was a lot of anger involved. The large box being placed over Michelle's body is one of the stranger elements of this case, though it might indicate that the killer felt some shame or remorse about what they had done and decided to cover it up. I don't know if a killer would intentionally plan to bring a large cardboard box like that to a murder scene, which lends credence to the idea that it was a crime of passion and just a coincidence that the killer happened to have that box inside his vehicle. That certainly makes more sense than a group of occult murderers leaving a cardboard box at the scene. It does seem like the man seen stalking Rochelle in the months preceding her murder is the best suspect, though it is surprising that he's never been identified after all these years. If what Rochelle's friend says is true, she had lunch with this guy on one occasion, but it doesn't sound like she ever told anybody his name. I'm not entirely sure if any DNA evidence was left behind at the scene, but if it was, then this crime is still solvable. Much like the recent arrest in the Jay Cook, Tanya von Kylenborg murders, perhaps a relative of the killer has submitted their DNA to a genealogy website at some point, and investigators could use this to make a DNA match to a suspect. But if not, should you happen to have any information about the unsolved murders of Michael Johnston and Rochelle Robinson, or if you happen to know the identity of the man who was seen stalking Rochelle prior to the murders, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, it's now time to move on to this episode's second case about a young victim who was heavily involved in fantasy games before his untimely death. Our second story begins in California in 1984, and our central figure is 17-year-old Kurt McFall, who lives in Concord with his father, Tom McFall. On September 8th, Kurt left their home after telling Tom that he was planning to spend the night with a friend and return home the following evening. However, Kurt never showed up, and that very same evening, his abandoned car would be discovered near San Francisco Bay. The vehicle was parked on a golf course in close proximity to some cliffs which overlooked the Pacific Ocean. Kurt's license was found on the car's floor, his keys were on the seat, and a $20 bill was discovered inside the glove compartment. Some empty beer bottles were also found inside and around the car, even though Kurt was not known for being a drinker. There was no sign of Kurt himself, but at around 10:15 a.m. on the morning of September 10th, some birdwatchers discovered his body on an isolated beach beneath the cliffs where his car had been discovered. He was clad only in a pair of pants, wearing a belt which was missing its buckle, and he had no shirt, socks, or shoes on. The condition of Kurt's body seemed to indicate that he had been in the water for an extended period of time before he washed ashore. While Kurt's back and shoulders were covered with cuts and abrasions, he had no obvious external trauma. In spite of the empty beer bottles found outside his vehicle, no trace of alcohol or drugs was found in Kurt's system. The coroner would eventually determine that Kurt had died from multiple traumatic injuries and severe blood loss, and while no one could be certain what caused these injuries, the most likely theory was that he had fallen off the cliff to his death. Since the San Francisco Police Department found no evidence of a homicide, they believed Kurt's death was an accident. However, according to Tom McFall, the coroner privately told him that he believed Kurt's death was a homicide, but did not have enough evidence to testify to that in a court of law. As a result, the coroner's official ruling said, "Cause of death, unknown." However, Tom was convinced his son had been murdered, due largely to a strange phone call he had received from one of Kurt's friends on September 9th, the day before Kurt's body was found. According to this friend, Kurt had become involved in a satanic cult which specialized in black magic, and Kurt was in fear for his life and attempting to escape the cult. This compelled Tom to search his son's room, and he found a number of items which disturbed him, including a knife made from a deer's hoof, a necklace of stone and feathers, and drawings which seemed to depict witchcraft themes and violent fantasies. 1 year earlier, Kurt had joined a group called the Society for Creative Anachronism, aka the SCA, which specialized in reliving medieval customs. Every week, they would dress in medieval costumes and practice sword fighting and jousting in the parking lot of an Oakland subway station. During his time with the group, Kurt had constructed his own suit of armor to participate in these activities and usually kept it in the trunk of his car, but the armor was conspicuously missing when the vehicle was discovered on the golf course. Kurt had felt compelled to join the SCA due to his immense interest in the fantasy tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, which had become a pop culture phenomenon by the 1980s. His time with the SCA eventually led him to joining a second group which taught paganism, but according to Kurt's friend, the group functioned like a cult, and caused Kurt to develop such an obsession with paganism that he adopted it as his official religion. Kurt's attitude apparently underwent a drastic change, and his friend likened Kurt's involvement with the group to a drug addiction. The leader of this pagan group was 36-year-old Gabriel Carrillo, who went by the ancient Welsh nickname Caradoc. Caradoc just happened to be the friend Kurt was spending the night with when he left his home on September 8th, and Caradoc's apartment was located less than 2 miles away from the beach where Kurt's body was discovered. According to Caradoc, he and Kurt spent the evening together going out to dinner and seeing a movie. Kurt then decided to go swimming at Ocean Beach at around midnight before he returned to Caradoc's apartment. However, Caradoc claimed that at around 3 a.m., Kurt told him that he was having trouble sleeping, so he was going to return to Ocean Beach to go swimming again. This was the last time Caradoc said he saw Kurt, but he denied having any involvement in his death, and believed that Kurt had been the victim of an unfortunate tragic accident. Caradoc also denied any accusations that his pagan group functioned like a cult, and that he exerted any control over his students. But Tom McFall continued to believe there was foul play in his son's death, and that Kurt might have been murdered because he uncovered something sinister within Caradoc's group. Since the San Francisco PD was no longer investigating Kurt's case, Tom took the story to Unsolved Mysteries. It was featured in one of the show's earliest episodes in February of 1988, but failed to generate any substantial leads to change the course of the investigation. On January 1, 2007, Gabriel Caradoc Carrillo passed away at the age of 58, but there have been no developments in this case during the past 30 years. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Once again, I'll start off my analysis with an actual quote by Robert Stack from the Unsolved Mystery segment. Tom now believes that Kurt strayed from a suburban middle-class background into a world of witchcraft, mysticism, and possibly murder. Needless to say, this is an Unsolved Mystery segment which is a time capsule of a much different era. It was featured in only the second episode Robert Stack hosted, and if you watch the series on Amazon Prime, it'll be the second episode in your queue. Since Unsolved Mysteries was uploaded to Amazon last year, It's been quite amusing to see the reactions from people who've never watched this segment before or are revisiting it for the first time in years. Don't get me wrong, this is a very tragic story, and I feel nothing but the utmost sympathy for Tom McFall, who seemed like a nice man and was clearly having a hard time dealing with the loss of his son. But I seriously doubt that Kurt was killed because he had an interest in what we can now see are very harmless hobbies. I previously discussed this during my episode about the disappearance of Kelly Day Wilson, but the 1980s and early 90s were definitely the era of satanic panic in the United States, and Unsolved Mysteries featured its fair share of cases which alleged the involvement of a satanic cult. Even though Kurt's interest in Dungeons & Dragons is mostly irrelevant to his story, I'm not surprised that they made mention of it, because the game was surrounded by controversy during the 80s, amidst allegations that it promoted such things as Satanism and witchcraft, and could drive players to lose their grip on reality, commit suicide, or even commit murder. In 1984, there was actually a horrific crime which took place in my hometown of Orangeville, Ontario, Canada, in which a pair of siblings, 11-year-old Daniel Babineau and his 9-year-old sister Monique, were murdered by a teenage boy, and a lot of emphasis was placed on the fact that the perpetrator was a fanatical D&D player. Of course, we now know that fantasy role-playing games on their own do not drive someone to commit murder, but you can see how there was a serious moral panic about this at the time. The height of ridiculousness in the Unsolved Mysteries segment is when they show footage of the Society for Creative Anachronism, aka the SCA, and try to pass it off as something ominous. You see this type of activity all the time today, and it's called LARPing. The SCA is still around today, and they even have their own Wikipedia page, which states that they now have over 30,000 members. The SCA president at that time, Hilary Powers, did her Unsolved Mysteries interview while dressed in medieval garb, and she seems completely harmless. I don't know how true this is, but I've read online that Powers was none too happy because Unsolved Mysteries filmed a bunch of other interview footage of her in her office, dressed in regular clothing, but decided not to use any of it, probably to further their narrative that Kurt spent all his free time hanging around with oddballs. And then there's Gabriel Carrillo, aka Caradoc. Unsolved Mysteries showed footage of one of Caradoc's sessions where he and his students sat around his living room doing pagan chants in front of candles. Again, this might have seemed weird at the time, but today it just comes across as a group of harmless people showing interest in a different religion. You can actually find Gabriel Carrillo's name get mentioned on the Wikipedia page for the fairy tradition, which has a heavy emphasis on sensual experience and awareness, so I'm sure this was a major part of his pagan teachings. I certainly do not get the impression that this group was some sort of satanic cult. There's always been a misconception that pagans worship the devil, and that paganism and Satanism are the same thing, but they are not. I guess the key difference between this story and the Michael Johnston Rochelle Robinson case is that even if you discount all their stuff about black magic and the occult, those two were clearly the victims of an unsolved crime. In Kurt McFall's case, there's a lot more ambiguity about whether there was foul play involved, and the San Francisco PD seemed pretty satisfied that his death was nothing more than a tragic accident. I'll state right up front that I do not believe Kurt was murdered because he was trying to escape from Caradoc's group, or because he stumbled upon something satanic there. All the allegations about the group being a cult were provided by one of Kurt's friends, who was interviewed in silhouette on Unsolved Mysteries and kept his identity concealed. I don't know if this guy was intentionally lying or just confused paganism with Satanism and mistakenly assumed that Kurt was involved with something a lot more sinister. Either way, it sounds like Tom McFall completely bought his story. The timeline of this case is really curious because it sounds like Kurt's friend phoned Tom to share his concerns on September 9th, the day after Kurt left to stay over at Caradoc's place, but the day before Kurt's body was found. I don't know the exact time this call took place, but Kurt had apparently told his father he was planning to return home that evening, so Tom shouldn't have had any reason to be concerned by this point. But the call compelled Tom to search through Kurt's room and find these supposedly disturbing items and drawings, which suddenly took on a more sinister meaning when Kurt was found dead the following day. The impression I get is that before Tom received this phone call, he never noticed any warning signs that something was wrong with Kurt, even though Kurt's friend claimed he had noticed some drastic changes in Kurt's attitude and personality. So this means that either Tom really wasn't paying very close attention to his son, or Kurt's friend is full of it. All that being said, even though I discount the cult story, I still think there are enough unusual things about Kurt's death to explore the possibility of foul play. The big issue is that there isn't much information about this case online, aside from the Unsolved Mystery segment, and the only other time I've seen Kurt's death mentioned in any media outlets is when a couple of newspapers published some sensationalistic articles in November of 1987 about young people becoming involved in devil worship. However, you will find a lot of hearsay and unverified rumors about this case on message boards and comment sections, and I won't delve too deeply into them because I don't know how much of this information is true. One interesting thing I've noticed during my online searches is that I found a number of posts from different people who claim they knew Kurt, yet they often seem to say contradictory things about him. For instance, you'll have one person say he was very popular in school, while someone else will say he was a loner. I saw one post from a former friend who claimed that Kurt was a virgin, but a blog from another former friend who said that, quote, Kurt's discussions of his sexual adventures were getting weirder and weirder, end quote. If you go to Kurt McFall's profile page at the Unsolved Mysteries website, the comment section is very interesting, as one commenter claims that Caradoc was into ritual cutting, which would explain the cuts and abrasions on Kurt's back and shoulders, only for another commenter to reply that these claims about Caradoc are hogwash. You'll find a lot of unverified rumors online that Gabriel, Caradoc, Carrillo displayed sexually inappropriate behavior with the students in his group, but again, that's nothing more than hearsay, so take everything you read about him or Kurt with a huge grain of salt. What is verifiable is that Caradoc passed away in 2007, and you can find a couple of obituaries for him online which provide information about his background and confirm that he was gay, was survived by a male partner at the time of his death, and a prominent gay rights activist. Now, I can see why people might jump to some unsettling conclusions over a 36-year-old gay man having a 17-year-old boy spend the night at his apartment right before he wound up dead. While Caradoc does come across as an unusual character, it must be stated that no one has ever uncovered any hard evidence that he did anything wrong. It doesn't sound like Kurt's father had any issues with him spending the night at Caradoc's place, though it's unclear if Tom had even met Caradoc before or knew who he was. During his Unsolved Mysteries interview, Caradoc does raise a valid point when he says, quote, If I wanted to murder somebody, the last person I would murder would be somebody who was staying at my house and whose father knew that he was staying at my house, end quote. This would imply Kurt did specifically tell his father where he was staying, and if Tom had no problem with it, this lends credence to the idea that Kurt never gave off any warning signs to his father that something was wrong prior to his death. But let's examine Caradoc's story about what happened that night. I will admit that Caradoc's claim about Kurt leaving the apartment to go swimming at 3 a.m. because he couldn't sleep is a bit odd, as the water in San Francisco Bay is apparently freezing in September, so that would not be the ideal time to go for a swim. Kurt had previously gone swimming at Ocean Beach that night, and it sounds like he was planning to go back there, but that's not where his car was parked. Kurt's body was discovered on a remote beach beneath some cliffs near Land's End, a recreation area which is pretty much around the corner from Ocean Beach. It's unclear why Kurt would have driven to that particular spot, but his father mentioned that Kurt was an experienced mountain climber, so perhaps he was planning to climb down the cliff to go swimming on that particular beach before he accidentally fell to his death. Yes, that's a very unusual thing to do at 3 a.m., but it's not completely implausible. But the one part of Caradoc's story I'm unclear about is how he reacted when Kurt did not return. Remember, his body was not actually found until the morning of September 10th, over 30 hours or so after Kurt left his apartment. I suppose if Caradoc went back to sleep and woke up later that morning to see Kurt was not there, he could have just assumed that Kurt went back home without telling him. I'm not sure if he made any attempt to phone Kurt that day to check on him. Now, I don't want to accuse anybody of anything without proof, but if the stories of Caradoc and his sexually inappropriate behavior with his students are true, then I have to wonder about an alternate possibility, that Caradoc had no direct involvement in Kurt's death, but paved the way to Kurt leaving his apartment in the middle of the night. In other words, Perhaps he made sexual advances towards Kurt which made him uncomfortable, so Kurt decided to leave. He then decided to drive to that location at the golf course, possibly to go climbing or swimming to clear his head, but accidentally fell to his death. So even though there was no foul play involved, and Caradoc was not present when Kurt died, he lied about the reason Kurt left his apartment, because he probably did not want to admit to making sexual advances towards a 17-year-old boy. Of course, this is all just speculation on my part, but whatever happened, one thing I'm pretty confident about is that Caradoc did not perform some sort of satanic ritual on Kurt before tossing him off the cliff to his death. But even if Caradoc was not involved, there are still some unanswered questions about the manner in which Kurt was found, as he was missing his shirt, socks, and shoes. I'm also not entirely sure if a towel was ever found at the scene, which you'd think Kurt would take with him if he was planning to go swimming, though it's possible that detail was just never mentioned. I suppose if Kurt was planning to go swimming, he might have been inclined to leave Caradoc's apartment without his shirt, though I've seen no indication that it was left behind there. I certainly don't think he would have driven anywhere without wearing any shoes, but I guess it's possible that if he fell off a cliff, the shoes could have slipped off his feet and washed away in the ocean. It's also odd that Kurt's belt buckle was missing, but again, it could have become dislodged during a fall and washed away. I have no idea why someone would murder him and then take his belt buckle. When the Coast Guard found Kurt's body, they seemed pretty certain that he had been in the water for an extended period of time before he washed ashore. The cuts and abrasions on Kurt's back and shoulders could have been caused if he slipped and rolled down the cliff or hit some jagged rocks in the water. While the most common explanation is that Kurt fell to his death, it's also possible this never happened, and that the cause of death was drowning after Kurt attempted to go swimming. When doing some research on Ocean Beach, I discovered that it's considered one of the most dangerous beaches in the world, and that swimming is highly discouraged there because of rip currents. So Kurt could have parked his car on the golf course, walked to Ocean Beach to go swimming, but then drowned when the current pulled his body against some rocks, which caused his cuts and abrasions, before his body washed ashore on another beach. It doesn't sound like those cuts set off any alarm bells for the people who found his body, at least nothing to suggest that foul play had taken place. Of course, another explanation for Kurt's missing shoes and shirt is that he could have left them in the car when he attempted to go swimming, and they were subsequently stolen by an unknown party. The fact that Kurt's driver's license and keys were found inside the car would support the idea that he drove to this location and left them there because he was planning to go for a swim. If he had a $20 bill on him, he may have put it inside the glove compartment so that it wouldn't be out in the open should someone stumble upon his car while he was in the water. The unusual fashion in which Kurt's car was found is one of the main reasons people suspect foul play, but you have to remember that it wasn't discovered until the evening of September 9th, at which point around 16 hours or so had passed. If Kurt wound up dead shortly after he parked there, some random stranger or strangers could have stumbled across Kurt's car over the course of the next day and stolen some of his items, including his shirt, shoes, and the suit of armor he had stored in his trunk. The only reason the $20 bill was left behind was because they may have forgotten to check the glove compartment. That missing suit of armor is definitely one of the oddest aspects of this case, which might be why some people believe Kurt's death might be connected to his so-called cult. But remember, Kurt built a suit of armor for his sword fighting in the Society for Creative Anachronism. That's an entirely different group than Caradoc's group about paganism, and since the SCA was nothing more than harmless medieval reenactments, I have zero reason to believe they had any hand in Kurt's death. So the missing armor is probably nothing more than a red herring. If a stranger came across Kurt's car and found the armor in the trunk, they may have decided to steal it because they thought it might be worth some money. Whatever the case, I definitely would be curious to know what happened to the armor, since it's probably not a common item you would just sell off at a pawn shop or something. Now, one of the main reasons Tom McFall was convinced the entire scene at the car was staged was because of all the empty beer bottles found scattered around there. He was adamant Kurt did not drink, but Kurt was a 17-year-old, and people that age generally aren't going to tell their parents if they've been drinking. To be fair, no alcohol was found in Kurt's system, so it seems like he did not drink those beers. But here's the thing. If the scene was staged, what purpose would scattering those beer bottles around serve? Did the perpetrators want to create the impression that Kurt had gotten so drunk that he stumbled off the cliff to his death? Well, that cover story obviously isn't going to work if the autopsy shows he had no alcohol in his system. There are much easier ways to stage a scene than by leaving behind a bunch of beer bottles, which could provide potentially incriminating evidence, such as fingerprints. That's why I don't think it's implausible that someone else, like a group of partying teenagers or homeless persons, could have found Kurt's abandoned car during the time period it was parked there, completely unaware that the owner was lying dead at the bottom of a nearby cliff. These people decided to hang out there for a while and drink some beers before they stole some of Kurt's items, such as his suit of armor, and left the scene. I'm not saying that I completely 100% rule out the possibility of foul play here. It's possible that Caradoc's story about Kurt leaving his apartment to go swimming at 3 a.m. is true, but after driving his car to the golf course, Kurt wound up crossing paths with some unsavory characters who subsequently murdered him by throwing him off the cliff. But if that's the case, would they really then decide to just hang around the scene drinking beers? If the bottles were only found scattered around outside Kurt's car, I might be willing to believe that they were already there before he arrived. But some of the bottles were found inside the vehicle, which I think lends credence to the idea that some random stranger, possibly multiple random strangers, decided to hang out in Kurt's car after he was already dead. Now, if Caradoc did actually murder Kurt, I'm just trying to figure out how this situation would have unfolded. While no one can be absolutely 100% certain what Kurt's cause of death was, the only noticeable signs of external trauma were the cuts and abrasions on his back and shoulders, so it seems most likely he died from drowning or a fall. I really don't find it plausible that Caradoc murdered Kurt in his apartment, transported his body to the golf course in Kurt's car, and then tossed him off the cliff to make his death look like an accident. I think the only scenario in which Caradoc could be a murderer is if he and Kurt went to that spot together at some point that night, and Caradoc decided to push him off the cliff to his death. But what would his motive be? Well, I've already firmly established that I don't believe Kurt was murdered in some sort of satanic ritual, or because this pagan group was a cult which needed to get rid of Kurt to cover up their secrets. The only other potential theory I can think of is if Caradoc was making sexual advances towards Kurt at that location, and when Kurt rebuffed him and threatened to tell someone, Caradoc responded by pushing him off the cliff. But that still seems like a major stretch to me. Yes, Caradoc is certainly different, and for all I know, those rumors about his inappropriate sexual behavior might be true, but I just don't get a murderer vibe from him. And let's put it this way. Kurt's death took place in California during the mid-1980s, a time and place when satanic panic was beginning to escalate. Remember, the arrests in the infamous McMartin preschool case took place in California only months before this, and here we have Caradoc, an openly gay man who runs a group teaching a religion which is often mistaken for Satanism, and a teenage boy winds up dead after spending the night at his apartment. Given the climate at that time, if the authorities really wanted to build a murder case, they couldn't have found a more convenient scapegoat than this guy. But they immediately ruled Kurt's death to be an accident, closed the investigation, and even declined to participate in the Unsolved Mysteries broadcast. This indicates to me that they found no evidence whatsoever to indicate foul play had taken place, and no reason to suspect Caradoc of any wrongdoing. Now, the other alternate explanation for Kurt's death, which has never really been addressed, is the possibility that he committed suicide by intentionally jumping off the cliff to his death. It's certainly possible, but I haven't heard any indication that he had suicidal tendencies at this time. Of course, that doesn't completely rule suicide out, as people will sometimes take their own life without warning, but when all is said and done, I just think it's most likely that Kurt's death was nothing more than a tragic accident. There are enough odd elements that I can't completely 100% rule out the possibility of foul play, but if that did occur, it's more likely that Kurt was killed by a random stranger he crossed paths with, and not Caradoc. Like I said at the outset, this is one of those cases which is very much a product of its time, as the hysterical climate about Satanism and the occult probably made the situation look a lot more ominous than it really was. All that being said, even though the San Francisco Police Department considers this to be a closed case, if you happen to have any information about the death of Kurt McFall which suggests that foul play might have been involved, please contact the appropriate authorities. And if you happen to see anybody out there playing Dungeons & Dragons or Magic the Gathering or studying paganism or LARPing, please leave them alone and do not worry. They're probably not going to murder anybody. Anyway, another special thanks to Austina Kronk for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. This has become a popular recurring monthly contest for our listeners, and if you've already entered this contest before, you are automatically eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter the contest and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that the Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've released our second exclusive bonus episode this month for our donors in tiers 2 and 3, and it covers the infamous Jeffrey McDonald case, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I also wanted to take this opportunity to provide a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up to support us on Patreon, and they are Vanessa B., Natalie S., and Ali C. Thank you so much for your generosity. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. The three of us are actually going to be representing the Trail Went Cold at the Modern Love Podcasting Convention at the Intercontinental Hotel in New Orleans from August 10th to the 12th. We will be participating in a panel discussion and also performing our own live show. If you would like to purchase tickets to the event, you can visit podern.love and use our promo code RobertStack to receive a 10% discount. That's podern.love and the promo code is RobertStack with a space in the middle to receive 10% off. And if that wasn't enough, I will also be appearing at the Canadian Crime Podcast event, a live show being held at the Hideout Bar in downtown Toronto on July 22nd at 5 p.m. It will include myself and a number of other Canadian true crime podcasters, including Christy from Canadian True Crime, Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast, and Jack from Dark Topic, along with a couple of other special guests who will be revealed soon. For more information on the event and how you can purchase tickets, you can find a link to our Eventbrite page in today's episode description. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And we also have a Facebook discussion group if you would like to discuss these cases or true crime in general with myself and your fellow listeners. So have yourself a good week and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.